Welcome to this edition of Skeptics and Seekers. I am your host, David Johnson, the Skeptic.
Yep, and I'm Dale, the Seeker.
And today we have a very special topic for you. We will be talking about mythicism. But before we step into that pile, I want to thank Dale for his work on the Shroud series. It's been a very good series. He's put a lot of effort into it, and it's gotten a lot of feedback. Hopefully we can wrangle him into doing a special feedback edition just for all of you Shroud commenters out there. And I believe that Dale maybe wants to announce something special that's coming up. Take it away, Dale.
Yeah, so just so you guys know, when I was doing my own Shroud research, I reached out to one Shroud expert named Barry Schwartz. So he was the official STURP photographer back in 1978 for that scientific investigation of the Shroud. And basically, he offered, I asked him, and he said he'd be willing to come on to our show to do a special guest appearance, do sort of an interview for the 40th anniversary of STURP. Provide some answers for you guys, give his take on the Shroud evidence and some firsthand experience. So I'm very excited about that. Also, just to give him a quick little plug, so he's got the #1 site on the Shroud. If you want pro or con expert articles or just general information about the Shroud, I would definitely suggest you go to his website. So that's www.shroud.com. And he also had a quick announcement because he's becoming a charitable organization. So sometimes, especially in part 4, I was using some articles that he sent me that are copyrighted, and I couldn't provide those as a link or a source for you guys. But he told me that as of October, look for his announcement on his site on October 8th, as a charity, he's actually going to be able to offer these free for people to look at. So you can see if I'm making up stuff on that. You can actually look to those articles yourself. But yeah, I'll give it back to David.
Okay, and with that, we've been doing some special feedback editions, which have worked out well. And so rather than read feedback today, we're just going to spend the entire time talking about mythicism, continue to send your feedback, and we will continue to do feedback specials that give your feedback a lot more time and space that they deserve. So with that, let me just say, mythicism, this is a tough one. This is not an argument that I intend to win. This is not an argument that I think that I could win. I don't think that anyone could win it from that perspective. I am going to acknowledge that I am a mythicist. I am what I call a reluctant mythicist. So this is my coming out as a mythicist. It's kind of a dirty word in this community, but there it is. I don't want to be a mythicist. I never set out to be a mythicist. I don't think there's anything particularly great about mythicism. It's not cool. It doesn't put you into the niche with the popular kids or anything like that. It's kind of a hard thing to be. It's a tougher argument to make, and I would rather not make it. I would rather not be it. But as it happens, when I look at the evidence, it leads me toward mythicism. And so today, rather than trying to make a case to convince you of my point of view, I'm just going to try to explain why I have the point of view that I have. So I'm going to begin the case with some traditional territory. But if you read the blog, and I do encourage you to read the blog posts that I wrote and that Dale wrote on the subject, we don't deal much with the traditional mythicist arguments. And so we will get there. And I know that there are some people who are going to at least want a refresher on some of the traditional mythicist arguments. So I will start there. But once again, this is not my attempt to make everyone a mythicist or to suggest that if you believe in a historical Jesus that you are somehow off base. There could very well be a historical Jesus behind the Jesus story. So I want to acknowledge that. I don't happen to believe that there was, but I can't prove that there wasn't. I don't think that that's something that can ever be proven. So once again, I am a reluctant mythicist, and this is kind of why I got that way. So first of all, when I was a Christian, my assumption, I had a lot of false assumptions about things. So one false assumption, just to give you an example, I believed that the Bible, the Bible that we had, I knew we had various translations, but I thought that somewhere locked in a lockbox, somewhere in Rome, there was the copy of the Bible, the original Bible, and people were just translating from that original Bible. That's what I thought when I was younger. It was kind of a shock to find out that is not true. There is no the Bible that scholars are usually using to create translations. And then I figured, well, okay, but at least we have an assortment of original autographs. So if we don't have all of the books in one canon, we at least have the original autographs that these books are taken from. No, that doesn't exist either. There is no such thing as original autographs when it comes to the Bible. Original autographs are kind of theoretical. What we have are copies of copies of copies. And so that was kind of a surprise. And how we ended up with the Bible we had, with the Bible we have, is just it's an interesting study, an interesting journey. It's one that I took on, but it had a lot of surprises from me, or at least with me. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble getting words out today. Hopefully that clears up. I was subject to a lot of surprises, and a lot of my naivete fell away with canonicity studies. And so Jesus studies were similar to that. When I was near the end of my faith, and I was grasping for straws, I was trying to grab onto anything that would anchor my faith in something real. And so I decided to go back to the basics on everything and just start with the real things that we had. Obviously, there was a God. But what else did we have? Well, Jesus. Of course, we had a real Jesus. So never mind the controversial stuff. Let's just get all of the non-controversial facts about Jesus and put those together, and then see how close we can get to the resurrected Jesus God. And there was shock after shock for me in that study. Because as I studied, I went to old libraries, academic libraries. I read books, not just ebooks, not just online things, actual old, large, dusty books. And I did as much research as I knew how to do as a non-academic. And what shocked me was what wasn't there. Just like the Bible, I had some assumptions about what was there, and it was shocking to find out what wasn't there. I had a lot of assumptions about what was there with regard to Jesus' evidences, and it was shocking to me what wasn't there. So let me just run through a list of 10 things that isn't there. 10 evidences that if you haven't done any Jesus studies and you've been a member of the church for all of your life, you just might assume are there. These things are not there. So we don't have birth records. We don't have death records. We don't have any writings from Jesus. We don't have any contemporary accounts. By contemporary, I mean people who were there during the time of Jesus' lifetime, giving accounts. We don't have writings from people who were healed by Jesus. I found that kind of interesting. We don't have firsthand opposition accounts for Jesus. Now, Dale might be tempted to say, but we do have some opposition accounts. Well, no, we don't really have any firsthand opposition accounts. We have opposition accounts according to Christians. We don't have court records from either the Jews or the Romans. We don't have historical references that didn't come from Christians as the source. We don't have corroboration of major events, just a few of those major events that are not corroborated. The great census, the killing of the infants 2 years and younger, the magic star that led the magi to Jesus, and that Herod was so upset about. We don't have anything about the magic feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. That's 9,000 people who had a magic meal. We don't have any corroboration for that. I mean, it's a lot of people in one small area. We don't have any corroboration of the cleansing of the temple. You remember when Jesus went berserk and fashioned a rope and went all violent and cleansed the temple of the evildoers and the animals and overturned the tables and all that. All of that was illegal. In fact, all of that would have been a capital offense. We don't have any records of that. Matthew 27, we don't have any records of the Great Resurrection, any kind of corroboration of that. So there are a lot of stories that are not directly related to Jesus, that are part of the Jesus story, that if they happen, we should have records for, and we don't. And finally, what we don't have is a Pauline corpus that seems to know anything about the life and ministry of the man Jesus. So what we learn about Jesus from Paul, one of the early New Testament writers, we can't actually build much of a case for the human Jesus with Paul's writing. There's just a lot that Paul leaves out or doesn't seem to know. And so we can go into depth on any number of these points, and I don't think that we will. But I just wanted to give you a quick list of things that we don't have. And you might say, well, but we shouldn't expect to have some of those things like birth records and death records. I mean, Jesus was a carpenter in the Hicksville part of the area. But Jesus was announced as king before he was born. So you know what we have birth records for? Kings. So I think that we actually do have reason to suspect that those who believed in Jesus, those who came to worship Jesus from afar, there would be some records kept of that. There was an expectation that Jesus was something more than just some, one of the country kids born in a manger. So all of these things that I've mentioned, it's not just that we don't have those things. It's that these are things that we should expect, and we don't have those things. So that's problematic to me. Now, that's not to say that we don't have some early mentions of Jesus. So one of the things that Dale mentioned is that we do have some evidences for a historical Jesus. So I'm not going to sit here and say that there is zero evidences for the historical Jesus. What I will say is that there are zero good evidences for a historical Jesus. All of the evidences are very weak at best, or extremely controversial. So, for instance, we don't have any testimony from anyone who met Jesus. And I find that interesting. So all of the testimony that, and by the way, I'm not including the Gospels here. If you want to get into an argument about the Gospels and whether they're history or not, you will probably have to wait for another show on that. But setting aside the Gospels, we don't have any testimony from anyone who met Jesus. What we end up having are vague references that are neither his name nor his title. So some of the people that referenced Jesus, let me just pull up a website if I've still got it up. Yeah, some of the people that referenced Jesus: Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Julius Africanus, Origen, and Pliny the Younger. Well, you would think, well, that's a lot of people talking about a person that didn't exist. Except, I think that we can actually cull that list quite a bit. Suetonius, Tacitus, Origen. Some of these are references to someone named Chrestus, Chrestos. And in one of the occasions, it's Christus, Christos. But the assumption is, well, you see, that kind of sounds like Christ. It's got to be talking about Jesus, right? Well, we don't know that. Those are very weak mentions. And I think that we could probably toss that type of reference out. Pliny the Younger writes about a band of Christians, and so this is the other category of reference that we have. We have people talking about the followers of Jesus. And Pliny the Younger writes some letters, no reason to think that they are not authentic, and he is asking for advice on how to deal with this particular cult of people who follow Jesus. Well, great, but that is not evidence for a historical Jesus. That's evidence that there were followers of Jesus. So it would be like me saying, what should we do about those followers of the angel Moroni? That would be the Mormons. Well, it doesn't mean that I believe in an angel Moroni, but these are followers of the angel Moroni. These are followers of the Book of Mormon, and they obviously think that there are angels and prophets involved, and I would speak of them in that way. But you couldn't cite my referencing the followers of Moroni as evidence that there was an angel Moroni. And so most of the early mentions can fall into this category. And then finally you have Josephus, who is a historian, and he has a brief passage of Jesus in his 18th, I guess maybe what we would call the 18th chapter of Antiquities. And that source is so contested, even among scholars. It should probably be thrown out just because of that. But once again, the question has to be asked, where did Josephus get his information about Jesus? Well, he would have gotten it from people who talked about Jesus. That would have been Christians. This is not firsthand information that Josephus had. And so all of the quote-unquote evidence, once again, scant few, I've named just about all of it. Most of it can be dismissed on the basis that it's not talking about Jesus, but rather people who followed and believed in Jesus stories, and or references to a figure that is not named Jesus, but we assume Jesus, or is something so heavily doctored that it's kind of embarrassing that that's mentioned as a main piece of evidence. So once again, when you look at the quote-unquote non-biblical evidence for Jesus, you're expecting a wheelbarrow full and you get a thimble full. That's a little bit jarring. And then when you examine what you've got in the thimble, it's not very good evidence. So the last thing I want to do before taking this to my real point here is ask the question, well, which Jesus are we supposed to believe in? Which Jesus? There were lots of Jesuses. So if I were to say, okay, I believe there was a guy named Jesus who was probably a Jewish rabbi or maybe a political insurgent, and he got himself killed by the Romans. Would that be enough? Would I still be a mythicist? I want to read something from a website that I will link to in the notes. And it's not in the article that I wrote, but we haven't put that up actually at the time of this recording. So I will include this in the notes. You'll be able to find this. I just want to read a couple of passages from it to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. The archetypal Jewish hero was Joshua, the successor of Moses, otherwise known as Yeshua ben Nun, Jesus of the fish. Since the name Jesus, Yeshua, or Yeshu in Hebrew, or Jesus in Greek, source of the English spelling, originally was a title meaning savior, derived from Yeshu saves. Probably every band in Jewish resistance had its own hero figure sporting this moniker, among others. Now, before I read the next passage, he does go into a number of Jesuses from that time, a number of Messiah-type figures, and this is something that I knew about before. I just found this source interesting, putting a lot of them in one place. There were lots of Jezi to choose from. He goes on to say, certainly Jesus ben Stada was a Judean agitator who gave the Romans a headache in the early years of the second century. He met his end in the Tower of Lydda, 25 miles from Jerusalem, at the hands of a Roman crucifixion crew. And given the scale that Roman retribution could reach, at the height of the siege of Jerusalem, the Romans were crucifying upwards of 500 captives a day before the city walls. Dead heroes called Jesus would quite literally have been thick on the ground. Not one merits a full stop in the great universal history. So once again, whatever you might think of the scholarship and the sources that he provides for these claims, I do want to make it clear that these types of claims have been around for a long time, and history is littered with the bodies of Jewish Messiah wannabes named Jesus. So with that said, I could say pretty confidently that I believe that there was probably a guy in that region calling himself Jesus who aspired to be a religious leader, was thought of as a Messiah, who was killed by the Romans. I just don't believe any of the rest of the stuff the Bible says about such a guy. Does that make me a mythicist? I'm going to toss it over to Dale for a moment while I take a little break.
Oh, okay. Wow. Quite a lot. I tried my best to write down as much as I could of what you're saying. So, let's tackle your last part first, because, as you know, I was talking to David over the weekend, and he announced, okay, let's do a show on mythicism on our round table, and I said absolutely. And in my mind, I thought, okay, I know exactly what I'm going to be getting. He wants to argue that there is no minimal historical Jesus figure, the Jesus that Bart Ehrman or Dale Martin would believe in. He's more akin, wanting to argue Bob Price or Richard Carrier. Now, David was quick to disabuse me of this. Well, not so fast. It depends on what you mean by mythicism. And I thought he has a good point here, that I think it's good for Christians and non-Christians to know that some people, when they use the term mythicism, could have something else in mind. It would be important to, okay, well, you say you're a mythicist. What exactly does that mean? Now, that said, I will just say that I think there is a common understanding that most people, that word has in mind. So if you have an alternate definition, that's fine. But just be aware that could cause misunderstandings unless you clarify what you mean by that term. But yeah, he also brings up the issue of, okay, well, there's been these 3 historical Jesus quests, and maybe I could persuade David that there is this some minimal historical figure, an itinerant preacher named Jesus who is going around Galilee and preaching the kingdom of God or something like that. The Bart Ehrman Jesus, and he's happy to accept that. But that's not a full-fledged Christian Jesus. That's not a Jesus who is born of a virgin. That's not the Jesus who turned water into wine. And that's really the Christian Jesus. So, in that sense, every single atheist, they're a mythicist, or what I call broad mythicism under this definition. Well, I think that's fair enough. However, I would say that we're not just stuck with the thimble. Christians also have that little notion of sufficient attachment, which could get these other propositions. Once you have reason to believe, well, Christianity is true, then the virgin birth will come attached. And just remember from our show last week, David said he might even agree with my case for sufficient attachment if it weren't for the Bible errors. If biblical inerrancy is true, then he could see the case for this. So in that way, Christians aren't stuck with this thimble. They could argue for a wider case, for the full-fledged Jesus. So now going into his negative case. So these are the 10 evidences we don't have. And I think he's presenting this as sort of evidence that indicates Jesus, even the minimal historical Jesus probably didn't exist. I'm not sure if I misunderstood you, or
You
was
did
that like the
not
full fledged Jesus?
misunderstand me. I'm just saying, if the Jesus of the Bible existed, we should expect to see some things, and so these are the things that we should expect to see that we don't see. Now, that is not to say if
Okay.
some minimal Jesus existed. So, for
Gotcha.
instance, Barabbas, the name Barabbas means son of the
Yep.
father. Probably not a real person. I don't
Well,
actually expect there to be any
I don't think
minimal
arguing
facts
based on that.
about Barabbas, right? And so there are lots of different Jesus that I don't expect there to be any minimal facts about. So if you say the minimal Jesus, yeah, I don't know that we would have any records of a minimal Jesus.
Okay, so let me do this. That even against a full fledged Jesus, a totally biblical Jesus, I'm not necessarily convinced. You would need to prove that we do have this expectation, and something like, okay, you mentioned Jesus was announced as a king when he was born. Let's pretend that happened, or that's the Jesus we're arguing for. Why are there no official records of this or something? Well, I mean, Jesus wasn't an actual king in the sense that he was, the people in charge of the country and making the records, the historians. They wouldn't have noted this Jesus just because we don't have the birth of that other Jesus you mentioned in the second century. He was known as the Messiah. Oh, wouldn't we expect some records about him with his birth,
Okay, but
with his
but let me
birth or
let me tell you
death?
where that doesn't work for me. I'm glad you mentioned that. Jesus was not simply declared a king after circumstances of his life. He was declared a king at his birth. And it wasn't just a private declaration, if the stories are to be taken literally. The actual King Herod knew about this King Jesus. In fact, he didn't just know about this King Jesus, he devoted a lot of resources to this King Jesus. And so it is something
Yeah.
that would have been known and noted, I would think. It takes it above just some
We'll
some
take it.
peasant stories about a particularly bright kid in the community. This is, if the stories are to be believed, Jesus had the attention of the king before he was born.
Yeah, as a pretender though, like no, I don't think they would like the historian. Why would you expect Herod's historian or the scribe to make a note of someone that no, I don't, even a suggestion or a hint that this guy could be the king will causes problems for me. We're taking, that's why Herod wanted to eliminate this guy
Well,
if
but you
we're
see,
just
what
taking
we,
the
what
Bible
we should
literally.
have is a record of Herod eliminating the guy. You see, there should
Why? That
be,
would make Herod.
but there should be some record of something. Herod was so troubled by this guy that he sent death squads to kill every male child from the age of 2 on down. So he wanted to make sure
So
that it was covered completely. And you mean to tell me that's not worth a notation in a log somewhere?
okay, so here's the problem. You bear the burden of proof in this case. You have to prove this expectation, and I'm going back to what you said on Saturday. Hang on. You're saying we should have this expectation. Arguing as a layperson, right? But you noted on Saturday, you got to be careful. Christians misapply historical principles. They think something's embarrassing, but they don't know the wider literature. And historians have noted ancients don't record things that we think they should have. I mean, how many mentions of the major eruption of Mount Vesuvius do you think there are? There's only a couple. Most people ancient historians overlook details that we think they should include.
Well, I would
I
think
don't
that
have
things
a
that led to genocide would probably would
well,
be
it
worth a
wasn't
note. So I mean, that's all I'm saying.
okay.
If not for that story, and the wise men coming from the east, I don't know how far they came. China, I don't know where they come from. People apparently other people around the world knew about it, so it was not just some private little thing. And I'm not saying that there should be many books written about it. I don't know whether there should or not, but it's bigger than a local a wives' tale story.
Okay. So yeah, that I'm gonna, for time's sake, so I'll let you have the last point there. But yeah, it's important to note: is it as big or as mentionable as you think? Was it as widespread? How did the Magi find out about this? Was it common knowledge in Babylon and stuff like that? I don't think you can establish that, but that's what you need to figure out. Was it as big an event as you make it sound? And I don't
So
think we can get that.
I don't think we can either. So I'm just going to grant your point.
Okay.
I don't think that I could ever prove that. All I can do is give you my expectations based on the reading of the Bible. So
Okay.
I didn't invent these expectations. I got these expectations from the Bible stories. And I would say that the Bible stories are somewhat misleading if it wasn't that big of a deal, because it's written as if it was that big of a deal. But again, it's not something that I
Okay.
can, I'm not going to stake my entire case on that. Again, this is not me trying to convince you to be a mythicist on this basis. It's me trying to
Right.
make you understand why I am. And at the very least, to get you to understand that my form of mythicism is reasonable.
Yep. Okay. Okay. And yeah, present your reasons for the people to assess type thing. And I'm not trying to press too hard or anything like that. I just wanted to bring up an important point because it's common to a lot of your points, I think. So the last thing I want to bring up, because I
Well,
actually
I don't
did
want you to, I don't
assess.
want to leave this one too soon because I've got the list in front of me, and
Oh well,
I
I have.
anticipated your objection that these would be things that you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Okay, so I'll let you have the last word because I want to get onto the issue of Pauline silence, because I think that's the most important one.
Okay.
So I'll let you have the last point, but then I'm going to move on to Paul.
Okay. Well, all I was going to say about that is you're right that a lot of these things might fall into that category, but it's a pretty big list. And so I would be prepared to make the case for each thing on this list, of things that we should expect based on the person that the stories make Jesus out to be. Like for instance, firsthand opposition accounts. I would expect that educated Jewish people would write about the battles, the famous battles between the Jewish leaders and Jesus, and nobody talks about that. Or something from the courts. I mean, we've got cameo appearances from people involved with the Sanhedrin. So it's not like these are people who don't know anything and who are illiterate and can't write and don't keep records. So I think that this list, you could make a case that there's an expectation that you should see some of this. That's all. That's all I wanted to say. Go ahead.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, I guess just to spend a little bit of time, then we can take one of these examples because I think the most substantial one that you mentioned is this issue of Pauline silence in his letters. He doesn't really reference a lot about the historical Jesus earthly ministry and that sort of thing and those sort of details. And I take it you have, like, in your head you have arguments that yeah, we should expect this. You can demonstrate that we should probably expect Paul to have mentioned more details if he actually had a historical figure who's on earth and performing all the miracles that the gospels say he did.
Yes.
Okay. So here's where I would issue caution then, because this I'm getting this from a review, because I studied this argument myself. This is a good review of Richard Carrier's book, because he advances this argument. But you have to look at the wider literature, not just from the first century, but also in the second century, because we have later Christian writings which are acknowledged by all, including Richard Carrier, to represent a historicist case. We know that they believe Jesus was a historical figure. So I'm thinking of things like the Epistle of Barnabas, for example, which dates somewhere between 80 to 120 A.D. In Tertullian's works and stuff like that, but they don't give us specific detail. There's complete silence on things like Jesus being in Galilee or Nazareth. There's no mention of Pontius Pilate, or Mary or Joseph. There's no mention of the miracles of Jesus or anything about his earthly life. But we know that these authors, writing later on in the late first and early second centuries, that they took a historicist case. And even Richard Carrier admits, they thought Jesus was historical. So I think you run the risk of making an argument from silence and reading in what we think we should be expecting. We should expect more than what we have, when the actual data says, but these early Christians were weird. They don't always give us what we think they should give us. So I'll turn it. That's the point I just wanted to say about that.
Okay. So I would just say that there were lots of ideas about Jesus even then. There were different legends of Jesus, if you will, kind of like the legend of Spider-Man. How many legends of Spider-Man have there been? If you just ask the question, how did Spider-Man get his powers? There are 2 or 3 mainstream current answers to that question. So
Okay.
it depends on which camp you're in as to.
I didn't know that. I'm getting a good lesson in Spider-Man ology.
So I'm a Spider-Manist.
Okay.
And I have been for a while. So yeah, there are several tellings of the story, and Batmanists also have the same type of thing. How many legends of Batman are there? How many Batmen were they? They were all very different characters, and they have different backstories. How did he become Batman? How did he meet the Joker? These are these are stories that are told and retold in different ways for different people. Different people have different canon when it comes to this stuff. And so all you're suggesting is that there were different Jesus myth even at that time. So it wasn't just one Jesus story that everybody is riffing off of. There were a number of Jesus stories, and you had a number of Jesus denominations that did not get along, and that told very different stories and had very different scriptures. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, that's a different Jesus, I would say. That's not the same guy at all as the Gospel of Mark. So I will agree with you that you had different people who thought different things about Jesus, but that just goes to show that there were lots of legends of Jesus, and it's hard to nail any one of them down as the historical Jesus, or that there even was a historical Jesus.
I think I guess it is a little bit tricky, but I guess if you're approaching it solely from a historical perspective, you try to ascertain as best you can, well, what is the main, or the earliest, or what goes back to the original apostles to the best of your ability. That's not always an easy thing to do. Obviously, Christians today say that, well, that's the proto-Orthodox Church, which became, the biblical Christianity, the Jesus that we know from the Gospels and that sort of thing. So that in order to get that I don't think we can get that full-fledged Jesus through historical tools. They're just too blunt for that type of thing. We can't extract the virgin birth via historical evidence, at least that we know of today. Maybe in the future some smart guy will come up with some evidence for that or something. But yeah, so if you want the full-fledged Orthodox biblical Jesus, not a Gnostic Jesus, not some other Jesus, that's where you have to go into that my idea of sufficient attachment, which I think, like I said, you would see yourself agreeing with if it just wasn't for this notion of Bible errors or something like that.
There is the notion of Bible errors, and so I can't climb over that mountain of Bible errors to even take your sufficient attachment seriously.
Gotcha.
So that's. I mean, I know you keep mentioning that as, even David would believe me if. Well, yeah, the if part though is the thing that's not going to happen, because the thing that you cannot do. I don't want people to take this as David being closed-minded. David has studied this for most of his life. The thing that you cannot do, I am convinced that you cannot do, is convince me that the Bible doesn't have errors. That's just not a thing that you can convince me of doing. You can talk to me about why those errors are there or whether those errors are important or not, but you can't convince me that it doesn't have errors. And the fact that it has errors, for me, kills your sufficient attachment case.
Okay, fair enough. And we've already debated that, so I've given my take of why I don't think the Bible errors are an issue. Even if they are there. But yeah, I just understand, okay, that's a fair enough point kind of thing. But I think that's how a Christian gets a full-fledged biblical Jesus.
Okay, but they're not getting it from history. And the thing about mythicism is we're not saying that there's not some spiritual reality of Jesus. I don't even know what that means. We're just saying that we don't find a historical Jesus. Now, one of the things that we both wrote about was the various quests for Jesus. So I know that you're familiar with the three quests. For those who are not familiar with what we're talking about, read the blog posts. I think there are some links in there that can take you there and get you started. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about the three main quests. In fact, some might say there's been a fourth quest. But however you count the quests, they have all ended in not finding Jesus. So the Jesus that's found in these quests are a Jesus that the church proper rejects. So if you say, well, just look at these quests. You see, there's a historical Jesus right now. Well, most of the people in mainstream or conservative Christianity would say, oh, no, that's not Jesus at all. So what do you say to the fact that no matter how many quests for the historical Jesus we try to do, we keep coming up empty?
Yeah. So I would say I've already said I do agree with you that just based on historical methodology and tools or criteria or whatever, we can't get to a full-fledged biblical Jesus. I can't, to the best of my knowledge, I can't prove historically that Jesus turned water into wine or that the virgin birth is true. Maybe I'm speaking too soon, actually. Maybe if you had some kind of argument, which you noted is not part of this debate, but if you could speak to the general reliability of the Gospels, some kind of argument on that front or something, maybe you could make some kind of argument there. But just in terms of...
I think that what we would agree on... I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, okay, I'm finished. Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say... the point... Sorry, that last point, I'll be a couple sentences. So, yeah, I don't think... It goes back to, again, another convo we had. I think that there is a case for a cumulative case. It's helpful to, okay, well, what can we establish? Just like you did all those years ago. What's in that thimble And then once we got that thimble, however inadequate, we can see if we can branch out from there. And at the very least, it can take away stumbling blocks from skeptics, because in order for someone to consider Christianity as true, if there's no historical, even a minimal Jesus, like a Bart Ehrman Jesus, then Christianity can't even get off the ground. So it's worthy to try and take away that stumbling block as a first step in a cumulative case, perhaps. So I'll turn it over to you. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, no. Well, so I just want to say to the listening audiences, it sounds like we're stepping on each other a lot, and we are, but I can't hear Dale. We're over Skype, and the connection is really bad, and so there are long swaths of discussion where I'm not entirely sure what he said or when he's done. So this happened on Unbelievable, and I guessed well on Unbelievable, and Justin is a better editor than I am. So we're going through periods where we're having connectivity issues, and I can't really hear Dale. He probably has some issues like that with me, but it's not. It's a little bit worse.
It's not as bad
on my end. So I do apologize to the listener for that. That is not an example of me trying to be rude. Mostly, you'll know it when I'm trying to be rude. But that's
it's obvious.
but in this case, that's not an example of me trying to be rude. Not that I wouldn't be rude. So just so you understand.
Gotcha. Good to know.
So so let's talk about that, the Bart Ehrman style Jesus. Now, I don't want to necessarily talk about Bart Ehrman. It's been a little while since I read his book. Did Jesus Exist? I think is the name of it. I did read it. I don't know if that's something that you read or not. It's not the only Jesus book that I've read. I actually found this book by Bart Ehrman to be a little bit disappointing. I thought it was kind of a rehash of a lot of old arguments that had been debunked, or at the very least addressed. Mm-hmm. And I really felt like Bart Ehrman phoned this one in. And that's a kind of hard for me to say, because I really like Bart Ehrman. I like a lot of his work. I wish he and Richard Carrier got along better. But in this case, this is one of those cases where I think that Ehrman did drop the ball. I'm not the only one who thinks that. There are other scholars who think that as well. So that said, sure, there is definitely some scholarship, even among skeptics, who would say, sure, Jesus of some description existed. I think what we should do with the last 10 minutes of time that we have, though, is flesh out what that description is. So I have already said it's almost certain that there was some guy named Jesus who was a political agitator, possibly a rabbi, who got himself killed by the Romans. So what? That is that Jesus? Is every guy who meets that description Jesus? Because once again, there bodies piled high of people who meet that description. So where do we go when you say believing in Jesus? What all do I have to believe in the Jesus that you're talking about?
Right. Yeah, and I think that is a good point, because the Bart Ehrman Jesus isn't good enough as a Christian. I think you do have to believe more than just that. So that would come back to my notion of what are these essential propositions about Jesus that one has to believe in order to be saved. And so that's things like the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus as a just as a minimal set of examples. It could include the virgin birth. I'm not 100% certain, but I lean in that direction because it has potential implications for his being sinless, right? And not being under the sin, not inheriting the sin disease through original sin or the sinful inclination. But yeah, in terms of things like, did Jesus turn water into wine? I wouldn't say that's essential. I think you could deny that and still believe in the Christian Jesus, the Jesus that will get you saved.
Well, let's just zero in on the resurrection, because I think that's the one that everybody can talk about. I'm going to go out on a limb and say all atheists disbelieve in a Jesus that rose from the dead. Now, there may be some atheist out there who says, "Wait a minute," because there are very few things that all atheists actually agree on, except for the fact that we're not convinced there's a God.
Depends on what you define what you mean by rise from the dead, because we've got the John Shelby Spungs and John Dominic Crossan's, who I think are atheists, actually.
Physically, bodily, but they're not atheists. Crossan, yeah, they're not atheists. Yeah, but physically, bodily, died on the cross, physically, bodily, buried in a tomb, physically, bodily, resuscitated back into life and walked around again in a physical body.
Gotcha.
Now that, as I understand it, that is the traditional Christian definition of rose from the dead.
Yep, I would agree with that.
Okay, so I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'll just say I believe 99% of all atheists in the world disbelieve in that Jesus.
True.
Now, if that is a minimal Jesus criteria, then 99% of all atheists are mythicists by that standard.
Correct. Yeah, they would of course fall under. I mean, they would. You don't even need to go with the resurrection. They would deny Jesus' deity right away. So I mean, that would make them. I prefer broad mythicists. The term that you're calling mythicism, I would call that broad mythicism.
Okay,
so
but you would put that in the
banner.
spectrum of mythicism.
Yeah.
And when I say that I'm a mythicist, that's what I'm talking about. Now, if you want to narrow the band a little bit, I'm not sure how we do that. So
I don't need to. I don't feel any need. I couldn't care less, about these debates about what does it mean to be an atheist. Do you have a lack of debate, or are you making a lack of belief, or are you making a positive claim? I'm fine. You can call blue red if you want. Just make sure you define your terms. If you're going against the sort of common understanding of what that term means, just make sure that, okay, well, when I say mythicist, I mean this, and I mean this by that, or when I say blue, I mean red. As long as you define your terms, I'm happy to go with whatever you want to say.
So it sounds like we're defining mythicist the same way at this point, though, which is a kind of a broad mythicist, which says that if it's not the biblical Jesus that we're talking about, then whatever Jesus you believe in, it's not the same Jesus.
Well, for me personally, though, I don't go with the essential doctrines as defining being a mythicist or not, denial of those essential doctrines. I go with the common understanding. When I personally use the term mythicist, I think you're denying the Bart Ehrman Jesus, the minimal historical Jesus. That's, to my mind, that's the common. But
go ahead and tell me what you think the Bart Ehrman Jesus is.
Well, yeah, I'm not. So, like, just, Jesus, there was a historical guy named Jesus. He was an itinerant Jewish preacher going around in Galilee and Jerusalem, who was preaching the kingdom of God, and was, claiming to be the Messiah. And he was crucified on the cross by the Jewish and Roman leadership.
Right, but you understand that could fit lots of people. Even that description can fit lots of people. So just to give an example, if you say, well, let's narrow it down to the things that Jesus said. I'm talking about the Jesus that said these things that you can read about in the Bible. Well, even Christian scholars, Richard Bauckham, by the way, is the one that I was trying to think about a couple of podcasts ago.
Okay.
So I know that you know Richard Bauckham. But at any rate, scholars like Richard Bauckham acknowledge that the stories of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, were made up. So there are two things that these scholars claim. One, they talk about gist memories, and one, they talk about just making stories up. They're not the same thing, and they should not be conflated. So a gist memory is you are at a lecture last night, maybe something from class, and you're talking about it with a friend the next day, and you give him a summary of some of the things the professor said. None of the things you say will be verbatim, but you'll be using gist memories to convey what the professor kind of said. So that's a gist memory. But it's another thing entirely if you were to tell a friend, I was at a lecture last night and the professor said this, except there was no lecture last night. And what you tell your friend is just the kinds of things that the professor has said throughout the course of the classes. So that's just making stuff up. And what these professors are willing to admit is that the biblical writers made up speeches from Jesus. For instance, the Sermon on the Mount never happened. And by the way, I'm saying all this, I think that you actually agree with this scholarship too. Lots of things never happen. And so if you're trying to identify the Jesus of history, I think that we could argue that there is no Jesus of history who said those things. So what you're really doing is talking about a guy who might have said this kind of thing. And that opens up the historical Jesus to being maybe even a composite of people, because no one person said those things and did those things.
Okay. So I get. Yeah. Like I said, I do support what you're trying to do to try to get people to realize that the term mythicism can have a wider meaning, and you should try and probe when someone says they're a mythicist. Don't just have a automatic negative, oh, this guy's an idiot, he doesn't know anything or whatever. Try to probe a little bit deeper, find out exactly what they mean about that, and even if they do mean the minimal Bart Ehrman Jesus didn't exist, I still wouldn't, don't just dismiss that. They've got some, Richard Carrier, Bob Price, they have some interesting points to make that I think should be taken seriously. That said, I would say that when I studied this issue, I'm sort of putting myself out there on a limb for maybe a future blog or something, but yeah, I think the evidence is really strong for Jesus. I don't think it's weak, and I'm not going to get into that here, but I will put my money where my mouth is, maybe at some point in a future blog. I think it's even proven beyond reasonable doubt that the minimal Jesus existed. So that means I'm saying you're unreasonable if you I know that might get me in a bit of trouble saying that, but whether I like that or not, that is, when I assess the evidence, that's what I came to. It's
okay, but let's
over
bear in mind
95%.
that your minimal Jesus includes this man being God and that he rose from the dead.
No. So no, that wouldn't have been included.
Okay, so tell me again what your minimal Jesus is.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm agreeing. It depends on how you want to define your terms, right? I'm supporting your point that people can have different definitions of mythicism, right? So
No,
as a Christian,
I see that you're supporting my point, but you're still using terms. You're absolutely sure that there is a minimal Jesus and that it is unreasonable not to believe in this minimal Jesus. I want to know what this Jesus is that it's unreasonable not to believe in.
Well, the minimal Jesus that I outlined before, the Jesus that Bart Ehrman.
Yeah, I know you keep saying the Jesus that Bart Ehrman would believe in, but that's gone fairly undefined. So I
defined it. Remember,
not really.
The Jewish teacher,
right? And I said that there were a lot of those.
The color of his shoes?
No, I'm saying there are a lot of those. There are a lot of Jewish teachers with the title of Jesus. Look at my resources. I know that you haven't had a chance to look at them, so it's not fair to say look at my resources. I will make sure that you do, and maybe we can have some follow up. Maybe we can have some follow up conversation about this. because I am not saying for a moment that there's not some guy that maybe somebody pulled out of history and said, this will be the archetype.
Okay. Okay. So let's stick then. Let's just stick with the minimal Christian Jesus as I see it. Then, and that's described minimally the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I don't think you can believe in Bart Ehrman's Jesus and be saved. So let's forget about that. The minimal Christian Jesus that someone has to believe in is the Jesus that has the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So yeah, if you deny that, you want to, yeah, okay, fine. You can consider yourself a mythicist. I don't care what term you use. That's fine. Just make sure you're clear what you mean by a mythicist. And one point I just want to, because I know you and Andrew have debates about this. Andrew denies being a mythicist, and you say, well, no, he is a mythicist. So if I support your point about terminology being, adaptable to different people, even when it goes outside the common understanding, you have to allow Andrew to define his own terms. If he doesn't want to use the term mythicist, you can think in your head, yeah, but you really are. There's no need to try to impose, but you have to call yourself a mythicist because you deny the deity of Jesus or something like that. That's the only caveat that I would have.
I absolutely agree with you. So
okay.
We don't have a debate there. But what I would also say is that the term mythicist is meaningless. And if I can serve any purpose today, it's to take the sting out of that term. Because those of you who think you're not a mythicist, I guarantee you, to most of the Christian world, you actually are. Once you have the kind of conversation that Dale and I are having right now, they would, in their mind, say, well, you don't actually believe in the real Jesus. And that for them is mythicism. So it is not enough to believe in some guy. The reason why the various quests for Jesus have failed is because the mainstream church does not recognize the Jesus that the quests come up with. It's not that the quests don't come up with some version of Jesus. Every one of them come up with some version of Jesus. But the mainstream church believes that the only Jesus that's real is the Jesus of the Bible. And if it doesn't come up with that guy, then it's not really Jesus. And so at the end of the day, if you could get mainstream Christians to have this conversation with you, all atheists would be considered mythicists. And that makes the term pretty useless.
Yeah, pretty broad kind of thing. Yeah, as I said, I can see the point that you're trying to make, and yeah, I'm glad that we had this discussion to bring it to the people. It might be something they've never encountered before or thought about, how does one define what a mythicist is? So yeah, I think it was a good show this week. We're just over the hour mark right now.
No, let's get out while we've got some broad agreement. I'm not sure this has ever happened, so I don't know.
This is a rare.
I don't know what to do with this. So I think what I'm going to do is just hit the big red button. Bye, y'all.
Have a good week, everyone. Bye-bye.